Welcome everybody to our TRC 57 speaker series. My name is Ted Cadwallader. I work for Nanaimo Ladysmith Public Schools, as does my great pal Stephanie Johnson, who you see on the screen with us today. We've been walking a path to try to understand how to operate and work better on the traditional territories of the Snotnawas, Nanaimo, and Tzim'inus peoples. And as part of that, we've put together this TRC 57 speaker series. I'll start today just by acknowledging the territory where my office is sitting on the shared territory of the Tzim'inus and Penelchet nations. And I know Stephanie and our guest, Jody and Lawrence, are also on their traditional territories to Nanaimo, Snotnawas. And Jody, I think you're in Tsewwates, Musqueam, and Squamish territory. So welcome everybody. We'll start off as we usually do in the proper protocol on the Salish territories, and I'll turn it over to my great friend Lawrence Mitchell. Lawrence.
Aichka Tanaguel. Chacha Sashmin Aichka. Aichka at the Hayal Aitsquail. Ihuam Wimatol, Etzawatol, Almastol, Aquatla Aichqualman. Ihuam Landamathet Sap at the Sarhanst, Eater Schwawalitst, Eater Smenamst. Wimatol, Almastol, at a he kun say to Stalits to Ali Nashwalakwa, Ihua Eat on a quail. Ihuam Quamquamstuch at ICIs at Anaquel, Thema CIs at Ali Nashwalakwa, Tiwiath San Quaswa Kikalis Ikaki Nastimach, Ihuam Sletakanstoch, Donatwalmach, Haichka Quatstwa E at Anatamach at Anaquel Eta Maxquel, Nawash Quamquams the Nasali Titlesiam, Haichka. oh, 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 Thanks, Epka.
It's my friend. I always love the way that you start this meeting, making sure that that space is open for us to join and share this knowledge and share these good words. Just as we begin, I want to raise my hands in thanks to our friend Carrie Kilmartin at UBC Press for connecting us with these amazing authors that we've had the pleasure of learning from their knowledge. And it's my pleasure today to introduce our guest, proud Kwagwakewak woman, lawyer, advocate, former AFN regional chief, former Minister of Justice and Attorney General, author, MP of Vancouver Granville, and now on top of all of that, a guest on our TRC 57 speaker series, the amazing Jody Wilson-Raybould. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted and Stephanie and Galakasa Lawrence for the song and the welcome. Thank you for listing off my various roles that I've had and continue to have. Participating in Speaker Series 57 is an honor, and I'm very pleased to be able to say a few words from the outset and to have a discussion with you and people that have joined in about the ongoing and evolving for the better relationship between Indigenous peoples of this land and Canadians. I too wanted to say thanks, and I haven't seen Carrie. I don't know if she's on, but I suspect she probably might be. Carrie Kilmartin from UBC Press. I haven't seen her for a while, but she is. Hi, Carrie. I had the great pleasure, as you know, of working with UBC Press, an extraordinary publishing house, to in rapid speed produce From Where I Stand, the book that is what you're featuring today. And there it is. And just in case people, I suspect there's people that haven't picked it up or looked at it, but it does represent or reflect and cover all of those roles that you spoke about, Ted, in terms of my having the great honor of being the regional chief for British Columbia, and also being the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, along with what I'm proud to still be is the independent member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville. And what makes me proud is to represent Vancouver Granville, but not only that, the constituents in this riding elected the first female ever independent member of Parliament in our country's history. I think that's important in terms of representation, in terms of participatory democracy. But I'm happy to have conversations about the roles that I've had advocating for Indigenous rights and title. I have a particular soft spot in my heart because I know for self-determination, particularly self-government, as advancing and rebuilding Indigenous nations in this province and across the country as a necessary and important step to ensuring that Indigenous peoples see themselves in the Constitution, and in doing so, as is indicated in the title of From Where I Stand, Building a Stronger Canada. So the book is a compilation of speeches of some of the challenges that we have faced as Indigenous peoples, but more importantly than that, it reflects the great strides that Indigenous peoples have undertaken in terms of advancing their nation rebuilding efforts, from the most important work, basic community development work, and rebuilding institutions of government in our communities, and advocating on the international stage for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which, as we know, articulates the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of our people, human rights obligations on Canada, certainly, but around the world. So I guess I'll close by saying I'm incredibly proud to be an Indigenous person in this country. I come from a territory just north of where you are, and the vast majority of people I suspect that are tuning in. I come from the Muskama, Tsawadanuk, and Liuhuka people of northern Vancouver Island. My home community is Cape Mudge on the southern tip of Quadra Island, which is arguably the most beautiful place on earth. It's a place where I love to go back to. But I know that we have close relations with the Indigenous peoples from Snaunawis and related areas, close relationship in terms of being fisher people, living off what comes from the water and supporting each other as we continue to advance our rights and seek rights recognition in this country. So I'm going to leave it there because I could probably talk for a long time, but happy to take questions, and please feel free to ask me anything about my experience, whether that be as an Indigenous person or as regional chief or as Minister of Justice. I'm happy to take the hard questions or the easy ones, whatever you want.
Oh,
Thanks for having me.
Great. That's great. Thank you, Jody. Cape Mudge is a beautiful spot for sure. I've traveled by there many times in a same boat, mostly in the middle of the night, heading up and down the coast, delivering fish when I was young enough to do that well.
It's because of the tides, right? You have to go through.
It is. You better be paying attention through there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Stephanie's watching the chat too, and we've had a few questions come in from a participant who's joined us for many of these, Carrie, and he's got some questions too. So hopefully I'll get to those as well. Lawrence has had to leave us. You saw that he was in the mini big house at Snutnawis, and that means he's got to get back to the little kids who would generally be in that big house this morning. And he teaches them language and songs and culture as part of his job. So we're pleased that he could join us in the middle of his day this morning. Jody, as I mentioned at the beginning, our school district has adopted a CIS policy framework and a truth and reconciliation as a goal of our board. And so we've stepped down that path to try to climb the mountain that Senator Sinclair described for us in the TRC report, not really knowing what it looks like, and trying to figure it out along the way with great assistance from knowledge keepers here in our school district. So as we're learning to do those small steps often and walk in a more Indigenous way on these territories, you've been in the middle of big bureaucracies and continue to be in the middle of big bureaucracies that may be struggling with those same things. And so do you have any advice for our participants who might be in organizations and our school district on how to do that authentically? Because it's fairly easy to do it superficially, but to really do it as far as a part of systems change, we would appreciate your advice.
Yeah, well, thanks for the question. And I think it's an important one for us all to continue to ask in terms of how we can lend our voice, how we can support Indigenous peoples moving forward, how we can elevate these issues to the broader public attention. And I mean, I think by virtue of doing this speaker series, that is one really important initiative that you're undertaking based on one of the recommendations, the 94 recommendations that came from Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report through former Senator Sinclair and others, which was an undertaking and a report that really, I think, was instrumental in elevating awareness of Indigenous peoples in this country, the experience of colonialism, in particular around residential schools and the ongoing impact of residential schools. So in taking up that recommendation, I would say to continue to hold these speaker series. I think the best thing that Canadians generally can do, and I'm so grateful that over the 15, 20 years that I've been an advocate, an Indigenous leader, I think awareness has gone up significantly in the Canadian population. And by virtue of that awareness and education, people are asking questions about how they can become involved, how they can be an ally, how they can be more aware, more authentic, to use your word. And we're seeing that. So education, being self-aware, being reflective of how we interact with individuals, how we respond to news articles or media reports that we hear, most of which are sensational, if I can say that. I mean, I think that we all have a responsibility to elevate the success stories and the importance of true reconciliation in this country. So it's ensuring that we become more educated, continue on that road of education, whether that be through developing curriculum or curricula in our schools, hosting speaker series, building relationships, participating in local community events. I mean, obviously post-COVID, and I hope everybody is doing well and healthy in this era, but just becoming involved. And I mean, what can I say about bureaucracy? Bureaucracy exists in the Indigenous world and in the non-Indigenous world. And I think sometimes bureaucracy and, if I may, partisan politics stands in the way of actually having real and meaningful discussions as individuals and recognizing how we're all interconnected. So creating safe spaces as you have today to have these conversations is definitely the first and ongoing step.
Okay. Thanks for that too. One of the questions that's come up too is navigating those bureaucracies too, but we'll get into that effectively, but we'll get into that a bit. One of the questions that came up in the chat too is reflective of what we're trying to do in our school district and in other school districts around the province too. It's not a bilateral relationship, because we're on a territory with many people living on it. And so we've got local government, municipal government, we've got provincial government, federal government has a piece there depending on which municipality you're in, school district, and of course, elected governments in First Nations as well. And so there's many, many moving parts. And so one of the questions is about what can local governments do to be part of that reconciliation effort, knowing that they can have a big impact across a region.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure of all the initiatives that have been underway in your area, but I can speak to some of the initiatives that have been. I'm currently, as you said, on Coast Salish territory. My riding is right in the heart of the city of Vancouver. I think that everyone, from the individual up to the federal government, or depending on which way you look at it, the federal government up to the individual, which is the most important, has a role to play in terms of advancing true reconciliation. For the city of Vancouver, some of the initiatives that have been undertaken, which have been impactful in terms of engaging the broader community, have been around, it was under a previous mayor, but declaring the city a city of reconciliation. When city council has discussions, there is a broad and general awareness of the Indigenous peoples of this land. And it goes beyond simply renaming places or acknowledging the territory, but having an understanding, creating cultural awareness, training resources for city officials, to most recently, which I was very pleased to see, the city passed a resolution to implement as much as they can within their jurisdictional authority the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think that's something that should be celebrated. It brings awareness to the reality of the human rights obligations that we have, that particularly the government of Canada has, and provinces, and by virtue of the provinces, municipal governments have, in terms of supporting and advancing and upholding those rights. So there's lots of examples of what can be done. The city of Vancouver is just one example. I know there's a lot of important initiatives that are happening right across the country.
We had Sakesh Henderson on in one of our earlier speaker series, and he shared us stories about the development of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People from the very start, all the way through the UN. And he said it was an interesting place to start with a bureaucracy that didn't recognize you as a human being because you were not a citizen of a nation as seen like a European model would see a nation. So they didn't even recognize you as a human being. And to get to the United Nations Declaration, he said, it took a lot of advocacy, it took a lot of allies, but it also took a personal and a professional toll on those people who are working within those organizations. Some of our questions are from Indigenous peoples working within organizations and bureaucracies. And they're asking for advice on how to manage that and stay whole, which is something that you've experienced. And so there's a semi-tough question. Do you have any advice for Indigenous peoples who work within those organizations that are colonial structures for the most part?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I certainly have some experience in wanting to ensure, and I understand the concerns that Indigenous peoples have in wanting to maintain a solid footing in who they are and where they come from, and traversing across different worlds and different worldviews. I guess I'd start with advice that I was given from a very young age by my parents, in particular my grandmother, who's the matriarch of our clan. She always taught me to be proud of who I am and to know where I come from, and to know that I have rights, but also responsibilities to ensure that I use my skills and abilities, such as they are, to help to advance rights, but to ensure that I do everything I can to help improve the quality of life for our people. And I think that, those are, that's the foundation that has guided me through all of the various roles that I have held, including being the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada. And sitting around the cabinet table, and actually even before that, debating and deciding to run as a member of parliament, or to be a member of parliament, which was not an easy decision for me to make. It certainly had, I had many people around me, to be very open, wanting me to run to be the national chief at the time. Many people wanting me to run to be an MP, and I hear in the back of my mind the voice of my father and my grandmother saying, "Why the heck would you want to run to be an MP? Your duty and responsibility is to work for our people." But to the people that work in other organizations where they are concerned about their indigeneity, if you want to call it that, and maintaining their hold in their culture, I believe, and the reason why I put my name forward to be an MP, and the reason why I fought so hard when I was the Minister of Justice to advance Indigenous issues and rights recognition in this country, is because we need to have our people. We need to have our voices around all tables. I found that, or I know, and I continue to know this, that being a part of Parliament, or being one of 338 members of Parliament, it's important to have Indigenous voices there. It's important to speak up for Indigenous peoples, for other marginalized individuals, for social justice generally. And the more we have diversity in terms of the people that are making decisions, the better the decisions will be, and the more longevity those decisions will have. And maybe just end on a bit of a personal experience that I had I was and still am incredibly proud to have been named by this Prime Minister for 3+ years to be Minister of Justice. And I know that I'm not going to be the first and last Indigenous Minister of Justice in this country. I know there will be more that come after me. but it's incredibly important. It does show, in spite of what happened to me, how far our country has come. And again, in spite of all the news headlines and the challenges that I faced in that role, I wouldn't change being in that role for anything, because I feel that my being there and a lot of the work that we did has changed the dialogue, has opened up conversations around rights recognition, opened the door for speaker series, opened the door for ultimately actually moving forward and creating the space and the mechanisms legally and politically and in the hearts of Canadians to actually solve and create the space for Indigenous peoples in this country to rebuild. I don't know what roles I'm going to have in the future, but in spite of the impact and the a lot of the very public challenges that I had, and it was hard, I am further bolstered and empowered, and more than ever wanting to continue to use my voice that I have to ultimately impact Indigenous peoples. So whomever you are, wherever you're working, whether it's in the school district or in a hospital or around a boardroom table, know that your voice matters and that you can contribute to ultimately transforming relations. We have to do it together, and everything that we do is important.
Terrific advice. Yeah. When you're in the midst of it, it's hard to stay. And if you're alone, it's hard to stay solid.
But you're not
in there.
alone,
But
right?
you're not alone, as you just said. Yeah, there's people doing that in other organizations and boardrooms, and you have your family back home if you're away. They're around you. That leads me to this next question. In your book, you talked about a future state of Canada when reconciliation has become a reality, and you intimate some of those things and encourage and show First Nations some of the things that they're going to be facing as we move towards this equal partnership in operating this country. So there's a few things in there. One is around power sharing, one is around self-determination, but I'd be interested if you could share however briefly, what that future state of Canada looks like that we're working towards when we get to reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're on the road for sure, as you've said. I mean, ultimately, the short answer that I give to that, and I write about that and speak to that in the book and in the speeches that I always give. I mean, I ultimately envision a post-colonial world where Indigenous nations have rebuilt their institutions of government and are governing under and based on and thriving off of their Indigenous ways of being, their laws, their customs and traditions that have been in place for millennia, and doing so in a contemporary world, and where they are making decisions for themselves. That's the heart of self-determination, and finally feeling comfortable or understanding that not understanding, but having other governments recognize that they have a place within the constitutional framework of this country, and are in fact another order of government, and through and by virtue of the fact that they are self-determining, including self-governing, they have practicing and thriving cultures, ultimately living with an improved quality of life for their communities, but in neighboring communities as well. That's kind of a short answer, but there's a lot more that we can talk about how we get there. I know that there are communities, and I like to think of self-government on a continuum. I mean, with the Indian Act, which the vast majority of Indigenous communities in this country are still under, which is a very racist piece of legislation, a law that is still on the books. The continuum being the Indian Act here, and you move along the end being what I just described to you in terms of Indigenous nations thriving within the stronger Canada. But Indigenous communities are are in varying places along that continuum, and Indigenous peoples for many, many years and decades have exhibited extraordinary resilience in terms of ensuring that we have not lost our culture or our languages, and having a very clear path or an understanding of the path and the solutions that are required in order for our communities to get down that continuum towards a rebuilt nation. So it's on the shoulders of the leaders that have gone before us that people like me and other Indigenous leaders are advocating for what we've always known, and just need willing partners to build that reality with us.
Beautiful answer, thank you. We have a question from our tlugui, our kids in Tlishalagilach School in Yatlis in Alert Bay. And they're very proud of you, by the way. They're grade 4, 5, 6, 7 class there. And they are currently learning about UNDRIP at their school. And they would like to know how they can be part of change and reconciliation.
Well, hello everybody back in Alert Bay. Certainly part of my territory as a proud Kwakwaka'wakw person. I haven't been back to Alert Bay for a while, but I hope I get back there to see you. Thanks for the question. I think just asking that question as if in grade 4 and 5, I don't know if I would have been able to ask a question like that when I was that age. So it shows how thoughtful you are, and how important it is to understand who you are and where you come from and the rights that you have. UNDRIP has 46 articles in it that speak to, as I said, the minimum standards of how individuals, in this case Indigenous people, should be treated. Their human rights, and to enable them to survive and thrive. And I would just say to those young students to continue to learn, to continue, as I said before, to be proud of who you are. And you obviously are leaders right now at your young age, but I know we'll continue and grow up to be leaders that will advocate for your communities. And in 10 years time or 20 years time, when you're out in the world working, the learnings and the teachings that you have will provide the foundation for your advocacy into the future as we continue to rebuild. So I'm so proud that you asked that question, and your voice matters in those discussions, and talking about UNDRIP, or talking about our rights in Canada, and how important it is to be part of a community and to ensure that our communities survive, which we know that they will, is the foundation of everything.
Yep. Been here forever so far, so it should continue to the future. Yeah. Was that the question, Steph, that you wanted me to ask? I was so pleased to see that question pop up. One of the things that I've learned along the way from through the little Kwakwala I know, but the more Hul'qumi'num I'm learning, being in Hul'qumi'num speaking territory, Indigenous languages seem to me to be a way in which we can see the world differently, the way in which our ancestors might have seen the world. How might we better, as a school district, or as an organizations within a community, or municipal governments or federal governments, in whatever place that we're at, how can we better support the revitalization and maintenance of Indigenous languages, particularly in British Columbia?
It's a good question, and Indigenous languages definitely continue to need assistance in order to be maintained. I mean, we are losing our language speakers at a rapid rate, and what can we do to combat that? I think that there's been a number of initiatives. There's been a lot that's happened in terms of teaching Indigenous languages in post-secondary institutions. Some high schools and First Nations schools teach their language. That's important. I mean, I haven't been able to recently, but my sister participates in a language class that happens every Wednesday for 3 hours, where she continues to learn our language. My sister and I, her more so than I mean, I can understand my language, Kwakwala. I am not fluent in terms of being able to speak it, but I do have the fortune of having tapes of my grandmother speaking in Kwakwala. And I think what's interesting and important about Indigenous languages is that there are some words in our language that can't be translated into English, because speaking in Kwakwala, and I imagine for other Indigenous languages, it speaks in stories and tells stories about what has happened in the past and the origin of different realities, and reflects the interconnected nature between Indigenous peoples and the natural world, and our dating back to creation stories. So it just is a different way to look at our human reality and that of the natural world and how everything's interconnected. So if you have an opportunity or have time to take a language class or to have discussions about what words mean, and they change over time. I mean, in Kwakwala, there's many different dialects. My grandmother, Pugladi, she spoke the traditional dialects. And I wish when I was younger, I had immersed myself in our language so I could be fluent in that as a result of my grandmother speaking to me, but continue to pursue it, and whatever language it is you learn, whether it's Halkamina, I congratulate you on continuing to learn that.
Do you see in the next 2, 3, 4 years the federal legislation being signed off around Indigenous languages and supporting Indigenous languages? I know our AFN colleagues and other experts have been working on that with the federal government.
Yeah, I think that the federal government has made some advances in terms of languages, in terms of our legislation around languages, around child and family. The UNDRIP legislation is currently before Parliament. I absolutely think the federal government has a role to play in supporting Indigenous communities, in doing what they can, and Indigenous language experts to continue to advance and create study courses, et cetera, within their communities around languages to advance them. Certainly the provincial government in terms of curriculum in schools. And it's a partnership and between and among different orders of government, including Indigenous governments. And that's by way of supporting in terms of resources, money, but also ensuring that Indigenous peoples govern themselves and have a direct contribution, or a direct can directly control how they continue to advance and elevate their languages and make decisions for themselves. And bottom line, it's whatever federal legislation is advanced, whether it be around languages or children and family or UNDRIP, and how we operationalize that legislation on the ground in communities is entirely dependent, importantly so, on Indigenous people having the jurisdiction, the recognition of their rights to govern themselves and to determine how they go about ensuring that their languages and their culture and their governing structures survive and thrive within a cooperative federation, which is Canada.
Yes, that's a good description of that shared future that you described earlier too. And oftentimes allies might jump to the forefront there and take up that space. And so one of the questions that has popped up for us is where do you see supporters of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit peoples being most effective in supporting an implementation of the UN Declaration? and that systems change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that allies and supporters come in many different shapes and forms. I think fundamental to that is building relationships with people. Whether you live in Nanaimo and build relationships with Snaunawis or Snuneymuxw, or more broadly than that across Vancouver Island, just get to know who your neighbors are and get an increased understanding of the history, have conversations, but it really starts at the root of building those relationships, and through that relationship building trust, understanding the challenges that individuals face and how you as an individual can assist in advancing those challenges, whether that be, of course, not speaking on behalf, but being a supporter and in whatever way that is appropriate or that you establish based on the relationships that you have.
We have not always had the best relationships between our school district and the nations whom we serve in this area, but over the last number of years, we've become closer and closer, and trying to understand how we best serve our nations and their children on this territory. And one of the results of that, as I mentioned at the beginning, has been our CAS policy framework, and that it's one of those words that is loosely translated as walking together, but doing things together. And so one of the results of that has been a co-governed school. Quam Stuikwas Strong Children was a Nanaimo elementary school, and they've invited us to help in a co-governed way serve the students and the families at that school. So a public school on reserve. And we're figuring out how to manage multiple levels of bureaucracy. So we have an Indian Act, and we have a school act, and we have an independent school act, and all of them have their own bureaucracies. But basically what it comes down to is the strength of that relationship has allowed us to enter into some power sharing agreements. And I know that our treaties were power sharing agreements over as they were developed over the course of time. And so do you have any advice on how we might go about dealing with shared power at a provincial or national level? Because sometimes there's strong resistance on giving up any kind of power and control.
That is definitely a true statement if I've ever heard one. I mean, people, I've had conversations with individuals, whether it was when I was the regional chief or when I was sitting around a table in Ottawa, speaking with my colleagues about change and about the status quo, and about what reconciliation or rights recognition means on the ground. It's no secret change is hard. People fear moving away from the status quo, whether it's the fear of moving away from the status quo or not knowing where one would go if one moves away from the status quo. The unknown is scary to a lot of people. There's also messages that come out based on fear that the world is going to be transformed for the worst if Indigenous peoples take their rightful place in this country. And we need to break down that fear and have conversations about what it means for an Indigenous community to be self-governing. It doesn't mean that there is no place for other governments or other individuals. Indigenous peoples, and I'm speaking generally, but as an Indigenous person, I want to find and assist my community in finding their way into Canada, to look at Section 35, which recognizes and affirms Aboriginal and treaty rights, as a completely full box of rights to be filled up by Indigenous peoples as we rebuild in this country. That's not something to be feared. I believe, and this is the conversation that needs to happen, is when we do and we have been successful in that. only improves the reality in this country. So we need to get past politics when it comes to provincial and federal governments that uses fear to ensure that nothing happens. We need to get beyond words, pretty words that say we're going to do this, but not take any action. And where we get beyond the fear and the lack of political will is for us as Canadians, as Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, to continue to press the importance of actually advancing true reconciliation and knowing that the world is not going to turn on its head if Indigenous peoples are self-governing. And we need to get past the excuses that it's too hard. It's simply, not only is it legally the right thing to do and the morally right thing to do, it just makes common sense with economically, socially, in terms of where Indigenous peoples are and where we could be if Indigenous peoples are increasingly self-governing in their own territories and having and partnering with other levels of government.
I want to jump in. Thank you for that. I don't know, for 40 years, I've tried to imagine what Canada would look like with vibrant, healthy, fully functioning, self-governing Indigenous communities across Canada. And the only thing I can think of is it would be way better than it is now, right? It would be way better for everybody. A question from Kyra Brown, Guilford Island at Tlisalagilach School in Yatlas. So from Kyra, when we were learning about you in class, what is it like to work in Parliament?
Well, Kyra, I'm so happy that you were learning about me in class. What is it like to work in Parliament? Well, the basis of my working in Parliament is that I have been elected by the 100,000 plus people that live in Vancouver Granville, which is my electoral district. And I was elected to represent their interests, their ideas in Parliament, along with 337 other members of Parliament who are tasked to do the same. So it's a role that requires me and my amazing staff to work with individuals who have concerns that live in Vancouver, but also to represent the interests, whether that be around Indigenous reconciliation, whether that be around the electoral process, around the environment, around healthcare, which is incredibly important right now in Parliament, in terms of debates, in terms of asking questions of the government. I mean, it really depends on the particular day, but for me, whether it be doing the local important constituency work here at home in Vancouver or being in Ottawa, it is an incredible honor to be entrusted by the people of Vancouver Granville to represent them. It is their voice that I'm representing in Ottawa. And all of those voices, as we talked about earlier, are important in terms of contributing the diverse realities and opinions to the major public policy discussions and decisions that have to be made.
There was a question in here about free and prior consent and people's understandings or misunderstandings of what that might mean. Can you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, this is something that's articulated in UNDRIP. This is a concept, if you will, that people have a lot of conversations around in terms of FPIC, as they call it, free, prior, and informed consent. We have a diverse array of Indigenous communities across this province and across the country. Indigenous communities, nations that have rights to the land that they've lived on and survived off of for many years. And what we are undertaking as Indigenous peoples and working and trying to work with other governments is to ensure that there's proper decision-making processes in place that recognize the rights of Indigenous peoples to their lands. So if they're, for example, the federal government or a provincial government wants to, or a company for that matter, wants to do business on the territory of an Indigenous nation, they would be best served to obtain the consent of that nation in order to undertake their development project or to undertake activity on that territory. Not to get too legalistic, but many court cases, and they continue to go before our country's highest court, have been undertaken, and decisions have been made around Aboriginal title and rights, around what consent means. And from our country's highest court, they essentially recommend that you would be wise to get the consent of Indigenous peoples if you wanted to do business on their territories. Consent, or FPIC, has been talked about in terms of, and this is the fear again, Indigenous peoples have to consent to a project. Well, you'd be wise to get their consent. It doesn't amount to a veto in terms of stopping all resource development projects, for example, in territories. But it, in my view, and I had this view when I was the Minister of Justice, and I hold it to this day, it is important to embrace the reality of free, prior, and informed consent and create different and new pathways between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples, between and among governments, in order to have and pursue and move towards consent-based decision-making. Indigenous peoples who have survived off and lived off the land that they've lived off of for millennia have a different approach to sustainability, to maintaining the lands and the environment. And we would be well served to ensure that we create those different decision-making models based on what I know as an Indigenous person, the importance of consensus-based decision-making where all voices are heard. To me, that's the heart of what FPIC means. It certainly doesn't mean that we are confronting each other and that everything stops. I think we need to move beyond that reality and way of thinking, which is a reality and way of thinking that is trying to hold up, advancing the UNDRIP bill in Parliament. And again, that's rooted in fear. That's also rooted in not wanting to do anything because it's easier, but we actually need to talk about it. We need to recognize that until we have true rights recognition in this country, we're always going to have challenges in terms of resource development projects. We're always going to see, and hopefully not increasingly so, but I'm not so sure, blockades because of the lack of recognition of rights. In other words, the denial of Indigenous people's rights have held up progress and nation rebuilding in this country, and that has to change.
Jim Reynolds joined us earlier in the series and just talked about the role of the courts and the role of politicians, and how politicians and the political system may have left its own processes to the courts to figure out. So your message was the same as Jim's. I want to address Amanda Tanner's question here. Amanda says, I'm really enjoying your book and the many insights you present. What other books, podcasts, and/or learnings do you recommend for those looking to further expand their knowledge so that we can effectively participate in discussions around allyship and change? What are some of your favorite books?
Oh gosh. Well, I'm glad that she's enjoying my book. I know it's a bit of a tough slog to get through, and I mean, there's lots of them out there. I know that you had my cousin on for the speakers series, Bob Joseph, who wrote 21. Things to know about or learn about the Indian Act. I mean, there's lots of amazing Indigenous writers out there. I am a history and political science major, so I have read a lot of books on history, and I think from different perspectives, it's important to do that, to read those. I think that if you haven't picked up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and its volumes, it's pretty eye-opening. It's an important read, as is the report on murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, particularly because they reflect the lived experiences of Indigenous peoples in this country. And the books that I find most compelling, that I am most interested in reading, are ones that speak to the experience of individuals, whether in residential schools, whether families of MMIWG, or just generally Indigenous people speaking about what it's like to be Indigenous in this country. So continue on reading my book and others, and I'll put a plug in for I have a book coming out in October, which actually speaks to, it's just one of those books that I think, well, it speaks to my experience being an Indigenous leader and an MP. So I'll just leave it there.
No, those personal stories have the most impact in my experience, and that was a lot of fun having Bob join us as well. I've got a great picture of his dad and I up in Port McNeill at a pole raising that one of our cousins took for us too. That I would love to spend more time around Bobby Joe and his son Bob. Thank you for this. We've got a whole bunch more questions, hard and easy, in the list. I know we're running down to the end. It's been our great pleasure. I want to thank you, Douglas, for joining us today and sharing your experience and knowledge. I want to raise my hands to Lawrence, who creates this space for us every time that we come together, asking our ancestors and our grandchildren yet to be born to gather around us and join. I know all of our guests who joined us together today in the chat, and the questions that have come have been terrific. And it was a great joy to have our kids from Yatlas join us too and ask those questions. So again, thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you for having me, and everyone for listening in. And I wish that I could have looked at all the comments in the corner, but thank you for the work that you do. It's very important in connecting communities. So Gala Kaswa, thank you.